Our next speaker is Professor Leonid Kogan. Leonid is the NTT Professor of Management and a professor at Sloan. He has a PhD in finance from MIT, and he taught the rigorous Analytics of Finance course. He was awarded the very prestigious Amundi Smith Breeden Prize for the best paper in the Journal of Finance, and his talk today is on technological innovation, winners and losers. Leon.
Thank you. So today I'll talk about a project that has been running for a few years. It's a sequence of papers in which we try to understand the role that technological innovation plays in terms of shaping the patterns we see in financial markets and how technological progress affects various participants in the economy, including stock market investors and firms. This is a finance exercise, so we're going to think of it from the finance point of view. We're going to emphasize the evaluation questions and the problems that face market investors. So a couple of questions that we'll discuss today. One is the big picture question of how technological progress affects equity markets and investors. And within that, there is a more narrow question, which is how does it help us think about some patterns in asset returns, things like value and growth patterns, which is one of the prominent examples of empirical questions that we see. And this is, of course, part of the landscape of asset management as well. Technological progress, of course, is a very important driver of growth. And in the long run, it's arguably the most important driver of growth. And we could see examples across the spectrum of various industries. So this one, of course, is a very colorful example. This is from the IT technologies. If you think about the magnitude of these effects, the way we're going to measure progress is by looking at the cost of capital, quality adjusted. And there you could see that a computer, a modern computer from, let's say, 2010, that you could buy at $5,000, if you wanted to achieve the same computing power back in 1960, you would have to spend roughly $160 million, and this is adjusting for inflation. So this tells you that these effects can be very large, and randomness about this kind of progress is going to therefore matter. The question is, how does it matter exactly? So the way we think about innovation cycles is kind of different. So I want to emphasize it's not the same as business cycles, and you have to suspend your intuition that has to do with business cycles. This is a different animal. So technological cycles, they occur at different frequency. They're lower frequency than business cycles, and their timing is different. So it's not the case that technological boom has to coincide with the economic boom. They're just not synchronized. It is a different phenomenon. So there was a paper in 2003 in the American Economic Review that looked at the technological developments during the 1930s, and it argued that it was the most technologically progressive decade basically in the last century, despite of the fact that from the purely economic point of view, it was a very tough period. So that's the period of the Great Depression. And there were many industries that experienced a lot of innovation during the same time. So this just highlights that it's a different phenomenon. It's not about business cycles. So the way we're going to think about technological progress is going to be in the spirit of this Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction. We're going to emphasize the fact that technological progress is not just the tide that lifts all boats in the same way. It's very much affecting market participants and different firms in a heterogeneous way. And we have to understand who are the winners and who are the losers, because that's going to very much matter for the investors in financial markets and for our understanding of how firms are valued and how they're affected. So in particular, we'll think of two dimensions of heterogeneity that are going to be closely related to each other. In the cross-section of firms, we'll think about growth versus value firms, not necessarily in the sense of Morningstar definitions of what these things are supposed to be, but economically. Firms that are richer or poorer in growth opportunities, they will be exposed differently to technological shocks. And at the same time, if you think about investors in the public markets versus, let's say, inventors who directly benefit from technological innovations, their exposure will also be different. And together, these patterns are going to shape pricing in financial markets. So if you think about this, just one example. We think about transportation industry going back to the early 19th century. I wanted to use a picture of a train, right? Ideally black and white. So this is my chance to do that. So basically what you see is that there was a period of time when the dominant technology was waterways, right? So moving people and goods along the rivers and canals was the cheapest way to transport. And railroads were the newcomer. It was the new technology. It was at first relatively inefficient, so it couldn't quite compete. But over time, as the technology improved, railroads displaced canals and river shipping, and construction of new canals stopped, and railroads became the cheapest and the dominant mode of transportation. So that was an example when you see tension between the incumbents and the new entrants. If you fast forward about a century, go to the beginning of the 20th century, now the railroads are the incumbents. That's the dominant old technology, and the new technology is automobiles. And when automobiles first enter, we see a replay of the same story, that at first it's a small player in the market. And if you look at 1922, you look at how many people were moved by automobiles, people times miles, you see it's about a quarter of what you get from railroads. And then you fast forward 7 years, the ratio flips. Now it's 4-to-1. So automobiles quickly took over, and railroads were the loser in that case. And if you go forward, what you see is that the market cap, of course, reflects that. So in the beginning of the century, railroads were half of the stock market. It's one of the reasons why I use that example. It's not just because it's colorful, but it's actually economically important. So that sector was half of the stock market. And if you fast forward 75 years, the market share went down to 2%. And of course, if you think about the consumers of all sorts of services, all of these new developments like automobiles, airplanes, and so forth, consumers are benefiting from all of that. It's just that if you're invested in the stock market in 1900 and half of your portfolio is in railroads, which has to be for the average investor, from your point of view as a financial market investor, this is not such a great development. You benefit as a consumer, but your portfolio hurts. And so what this tells you is that when we think about the benefits and costs of technological innovation, we have to understand really how they're distributed. And our casual intuition, which is based on what's good for the overall economy, doesn't quite apply when you think about the marginal investor and who is going to value these types of shocks. So let me tell you in a few words the theoretical story that we develop. If you want to see some equations, you could look at the papers, but we have a few pages there. But basically here, I'll just tell you the story qualitatively. So the idea is the following, that firms and investors, they're exposed to disruptive innovation, and that's going to have positive effect, benefit for the inventors and the innovators themselves, broadly speaking, not just the entrepreneurs, but also everyone who's closely connected to them. You think early stage investors. But if you think about investors in the public market, they hold existing older firms, and these are the ones that are going to be displaced by the successful new entry. So from the point of view of the investors in the public market, successful technological innovation that's going to displace existing firms is a source of risk. But not all firms are exposed in the same way. There are some firms that are more innovative themselves, some public firms that are going to capture some of the rent from the new inventions, and others are less innovative. So if you sort firms along that dimension, we end up, roughly speaking, with the growth value sort. And that tells you that growth firms, if you create a growth tilt, are going to provide you with something of a hedge. So a growth tilt is going to be potentially useful as a hedge against displacement that's created by innovation shocks. Now, in equilibrium, of course, it's impossible for everyone to hold a growth tilt because markets have to clear. So collectively, investors have to hold the market portfolio. And so the effect is going to be that growth firms are going to be priced relatively highly because of the benefit they provide. So their returns are going to be relatively low. And so that creates a value premium. So this story tells you two things. One is that we can justify the difference in average returns of different types of firms by looking at their exposure to the technological shocks and how they affect it. And also when we think about co-movement among returns of different types of firms, why is it that some growth firms move together with other growth firms, and why value firms move together with other value firms across different industries, that could be driven potentially by technological shocks. So that's a theory. And to provide some support for the story, we try to measure technological shocks and relate those to financial markets. So I'm going to describe briefly how we do that. There is a challenge there that even though technological progress is a concept that's very central to a lot of what we do in economics, including macroeconomics, our measurement of technological progress is really rudimentary in a way. The way we typically do it in macro models is we account for the observable inputs, things like capital and labor, and whatever part of growth is not captured by that, we call it technological progress. So, but we really don't know what that thing is. It's a residual. It's called solo residual. So it's basically you take a regression, and the epsilon, the error term, the regression is the central object. So we're trying to be more specific and kind of find more tangible evidence for where technological progress comes from. And the way we try to do this is using patents. So we're going to look at the patented innovations. It's not everything, not all innovations are patented, but some of them are. It's a non-trivial set, and that has the advantage that the events when patents are granted are observable. So we could actually try to measure the value of patented innovations. And the premise for how we do this is that we are going to look at the financial markets, at the stock market, and we will look at the stock market reaction to the announcement of patent grants to infer how valuable the patents were. So if you go back to your first finance class, this is essentially like an exercise in market efficiency. We're saying that the market is pretty good at valuing things, and we're going to infer from market valuations which inventions are useful, which of them are not, at least ex ante. Exposed market can be proven wrong, but ex ante it has to be a pretty good guess. So we start by compiling a data set of patents. We're using a Google Patents data set, which includes scanned copies of basically all patent documents. And we start with this set of about 8 million scanned documents. And they ran optical character recognition on those, so they're digitized with all sorts of issues, typos and mistakes and all that, and defects of OCR. So we have to clean that up. So we use a bunch of linguistic algorithms, basically trying to get rid of all these errors and so forth. And we end up with about 2 million patents that we could match to publicly traded firms, which is what we need because we want to use stock market data to assign value to these. And now what we do is we do an event study where for each patent, which is going to be announced on Tuesday, so there is a publication by the USPTO about patents that were granted every week. So on Tuesday, you see which patents were granted. We look at a 3-day window around that event, and we look at the stock market reaction of the firm. Now, of course, stock prices move for many reasons, not just because the firm was granted a patent. So we need to do some filtering to figure out what's noise, what's the signal. But when it's all said and done, what you see is that whenever a firm receives a patent and there is an abnormally large stock market reaction, you interpret it as a response to the patent. And when the reaction is small, it's typically attributed to background noise that's normal for day-to-day price fluctuations. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We have about 2 million data points. I'll give you 2. It's going to give you an example of a good patent and a useless patent. The difficulty with this line of research, which is something that economists have been struggling with, is that most patents are useless in a sense. They don't have a lot of economic value, and a small subset, the very top of the distribution, like top 1%, is where most of the value is. So if you want to measure economic value, you have to really attach the economic value to individual patents. You cannot just count them. So this is an example of a patent granted to the Protein Design Lab, which was awarded for some kind of new technology for humanized antibodies in mice, or whatever that is. And they basically say that this technology is going to be quite relevant for about a quarter of all the drugs that are currently under clinical trials. And so what you saw the moment that patent was granted is that the stock market value of that firm increased by 25%. We don't analyze the context of these events. Of course, we don't read these documents. We simply look at pictures like these, identify the events when the stock reaction was large, and infer from them that dollar value. Now, of course, this is not exactly the value of this innovation to the firm. Our perspective is that the market knows about these inventions in advance. This is not a secret that various firms have various ideas they're trying to patent. The uncertainty is about whether or not the patent is going to go through and how strong it's going to look. And so the stock market reaction is proportional to the economic value, but it's not exactly equal. It's a fraction of the true economic value. So that's an example of a good patent. And there are many examples of bad ones. So this is one that goes to IBM. And it's a patent for a new system for restroom reservations on airplanes. So that actually collected lots of citations, but eventually they let it expire. They didn't even want to pay the fees to renew it because it was kind of useless. You could think of many moral hazard problems that have to do with implementing this. But if you look at the stock market reaction, then you could see that the market, of course, recognizes this is a useless patent. And the stock price of IBM doesn't move when this is announced. So here is a reality check. We do know that there is a connection between scientific and economic value of patents. It's not the same thing, but there is a connection. And in the literature, it's common to value patents, so evaluate them by future citations. It's not useful for our purposes because you need the entire future history to understand which patents are going to collect citations, which won't. We're using 72 hours. The citations literature uses next 30 years. But you could relate the two to each other. So what you see here is a scatter plot. This doesn't quite prove that what we have is the right measure, but it's, again, it's a reality check. It tells you that if you sort patents based on our measure of economic value, and then you look at heterogeneity and how many citations they collect, adjusting for things like patents being from different industries and different periods of time and so forth, what you see is that there is a very strong positive relation between the two. So patents that we label as valuable, they tend to get a disproportionate number of citations, and patents we label as useless, they tend to get almost none. And that gives you some comfort, but that's just a starting point. So then what we can do is use our measure of innovation based on patents, aggregate it, and look at some of its properties. In particular, we can look at the exposures of different types of firms to innovation shocks, judging by this measure. So this is a time series that we construct by adding up our innovation measure across different firms for each year. And what you see is that there is a fair amount of fluctuation over time. And if you look at the periods when this time series starts growing, where you see that the aggregate amount of innovation is large, that roughly coincides with the historical periods that we know have been relatively productive. And in particular, if you look at the firms that received a large amount of value by our measure, they are very much recognizable firms. They're the ones that have been at the frontier of innovation at different periods. And that leadership rotates. Right? If you look at the 1930s, it's a different set of industries. You're talking like General Motors, AT&T, as opposed to the recent periods like 1990s and early 2000s, where it's more about information technology and computing. So it's a different set of firms. All right. So now we have this tool. We have a measure of innovation that we could use. It's quantitative. Let's apply it to try to quantify heterogeneity and risk at the firm level. This is one of the exercises that we do. We're going to sort firms in terms of how rich or poor they are in growth opportunities. And then the premise of our theory is that firms that are rich in growth opportunities, they will have a relatively higher positive exposure to innovation shocks. But firms that are poor in growth opportunities themselves, they'll be more vulnerable, and they'll be exposed to more risk of displacement. We don't observe how rich firms are in growth opportunities. That's another thing that's unobservable. But we have some market-based proxies that are noisy proxies for richness in growth opportunities. Things like valuation ratios, like market to book. It's not exactly a measure of how rich you are in growth opportunities, but it's related. Or, say, past investment. Firms that have more growth opportunities, that tend to realize them and they invest more. Firms that have no growth opportunities, they tend not to invest. And so we have a bunch of empirical proxies for growth. None of them are perfect, but we could see to what extent they work. So let's start with a pattern that's fairly well known, and this is a subject of a lot of analysis. We can sort firms on a couple of characteristics, like the market-to-book ratio or past investment. And what you see is that there is a lot of predictability in their returns. That firms that have high valuation ratios or firms that invested a lot recently, they tend to have relatively low returns. These are the ones on the right of this graph. These are the high valuation, high investment firms. Firms that tend to invest little or that invested little recently, and firms that have low market-to-book ratio that tend to outperform in absolute terms. So we see absolute differences in returns. Now the question is, what does that difference mean? Is this a reflection of risk? Well, it's certainly not a reflection of the market risk. So that's why this pattern has been one of the puzzles in empirical finance literature, that if you try to explain this heterogeneity in return by appealing to models like CAPM, which emphasizes exposure to the market risk, you see that it doesn't really capture cross-sectional heterogeneity. Essentially, all of this is alpha relative to CAPM. So if you look at the value firms, low investment firms, they have abnormally high risk-adjusted returns if you adjust using market exposures. And then the growth firms or high investment firms that have low or negative risk-adjusted returns. So this is a well-known result. This is our starting point. What we're trying to say is that maybe if we consider innovation risk, in addition to the market risk, we could make sense out of these patterns. So what we can do is evaluate heterogeneous exposures to innovation shocks in that dimension. Right? We could look at the exposure of value firms to innovation shocks, controlling for market risk, or growth firms, or low investment, high investment. And what you see in this picture is that cross-sectional patterns in these risk exposures, they line up pretty much with what you see in returns. That firms on the left, these are going to be low market to book, these are your value firms. They have negative loading innovation shock. These firms, they lose value when there is a positive aggregate innovation shock. And we could see that not just in terms of the stock prices, but in terms of real measures like cash flows, they do decline. The market value drops, their sales drop, they start hiring less, they invest less, and so forth. So there is a slowdown of their economic activity as well. And on the right, you see high investment, high growth firms, and they tend to benefit on average when there is a positive aggregate shock. So what you see from this picture is that accounting for heterogeneity in firms' exposures to innovation shocks can help you make sense out of these patterns in returns that otherwise seem puzzling, because you see heterogeneity in risk premia, but it doesn't seem to be reflected in different market risk. So this story tells you that stock market risk is not the whole story. There is more to be understood by looking at the specific economic sources of fluctuations. Now, in terms of the future directions where this project is going, there is a wide variety of questions we can consider, because we're essentially adding a new consideration to the basic paradigm. It's a different kind of risk that we are proposing to focus on. But one direction that would be very interesting is to think about how individual investors, how households, or investors more generally, how they're exposed to innovation shocks, and how this may help us to understand patterns in portfolio holdings. So this is the subject of the field of household finance. The difficulty there, of course, is with data availability. We see stock prices relatively easily with low measurement errors, but we don't have very precise information about individual behavior and portfolio holdings, so that's more messy. But there is some progress being made on that front. Data is becoming more and more available. So here's just one example. There was a recent study using Swedish household data where it's possible to observe individual portfolios and other things. They can see investors' wealth, households' wealth, and where they work. And they know a lot. It's a big brother kind of deal. So they know many things about individual investors, and that's very useful for academic research. In the US, we don't have the same level of insight. Maybe the government does. We don't get access to that. But here's what they find in that study. They find that there are actually strong patterns in terms of what type of investor has growth versus value tilt. Collectively, there is no tilt in the market, of course. Collectively, they hold the market. But different types of investors, they tend to deviate from the market portfolio in predictable directions. So in particular, they find that younger investors, they tend to invest more in growth, and older investors invest more in value. So there is a very strong pattern with respect to age. And if you think about human capital, investors with lower human capital tend to invest in value. That's consistent, right? Because older investors, they have more financial capital relative to their human capital. And higher human capital, higher level of education, more entrepreneurial investors, they tend to invest more in growth. And so the next step is to try to use the insights from our analysis to understand these types of patterns. Why is it that we see that kind of heterogeneity in household behavior? Is that about psychology, or is this very much rational about people kind of creating a tilt in their risk exposures based on their background risk? You have human capital risk, you have different horizons depending on the age. And so I will end with this picture. If you cannot read the text there, it basically says, innovation, if it can make your job easier, it can probably make it irrelevant. And what this suggests is that human capital is very much at risk when it comes to innovation shocks. And to understand that risk, we have to think very much from the individual point of view. And at the aggregate level, it may be that new technologies make labor more productive, but not every individual is becoming more productive. There's a lot of heterogeneity. And so if you're a COBOL programmer, then developments in the IT technology, that's not a great news, but so there is a lot to be understood here. And when you think from this point of view, now you can start making sense of the fact that investors with more or less human capital, they're going to view risk-return trade-off from value growth investment differently. So I will end with this and take your questions. Yes.
Well, you had a slide about halfway through which showed all the 30s, the 60s, 2000s, and it looked to me as if on the far end of the 2000s, the current era, that the innovation was having a bigger effect on the stock market than in the past. Is that, can everybody hear me? Sorry, okay. Is that true, and what are the implications for valuations in the current stock market if innovation is playing a greater role in stock market performance?
To be honest, I would not draw the same conclusion from that graph in a sense that we don't have enough precision to interpret individual points on the time series, right? We could think about broader patterns across that sample period, but that sample period, even though it's quite long, it's barely long enough to draw reliable conclusions. So I wouldn't really say that at the very end of 2000s, something has changed relative to the 1990s. I think it's very hard to make that statement. If you really want to think about differences across the decades, you have to look deeper at the cross-section. Not at the aggregate numbers, but you have to think about the cross-section of firms, which industries, which specific firms are innovating more or less. That's very much a cross-sectional question, not a time series. So you may be right that there may be a change relative to what we have seen in the previous decade, but I don't think we can draw that conclusion from that particular graph. We need to look at the microdata to really say anything on that front.
Is one way to think about the model you presented that the lower returns to growth are basically your insurance in the event of an innovation shock, so that you're happy to have a low return because in the event you get that shock, you'll get the payoff?
Essentially, yes. So hedging property of growth stocks, it's another way of saying that they do provide some insurance. The flip side of that is that why don't you just load up on value and collect all of that premium? And the answer is that it's going to be very painful when there is a technological shock and value firms get displaced.
You know, interesting noting the 1930s was a period of substantial government intervention in the economy, and right now, one of the things when you talk about winners and losers is, right, I think most people view that right now the winners are big winners, and allocation of the rewards of what's happening in the economy, and and I think in the 30s there was substantial government intervention at the time. Are there implications of this if you take that to overall, fiscal policy, be it, stabilizers, automatic or not, in terms of what transpires when there's technological innovation and the role that the government plays in allocating the rewards to winners and losers and providing a hedge for the non-winners at a systematic level?
Well, that will be very much outside of our model where there is no government. There is no role for that. We have perfect financial markets. But we can speculate. First of all, I would not draw any causal link there between government activities and developments that we see, for example, in terms of overall technological progress. So we're talking about 2 data points. And even then, if you have 20, still, causally, you cannot say anything. One tidbit is that in our model, we did look at things like inequality, and we looked at that empirically as well. And what you do see is that in our description of the economy, there is no role for rent-seeking or any of these issues that are being the subject of the debate when we think about inequality. Right? The good and bad inequality. The good kind is Steve Jobs becoming rich because of successful innovation, and the bad kind is some government crony becoming rich because the kind of getting subsidies implicitly, explicitly. So we don't have the bad kind in the model, so that we can really say what's going on, because in our model, inequality arises as a byproduct of technological progress, and it's all driven by the underlying economic growth. There is no dislocation. Having said that, what we see is that our model does account for the magnitude of the changes in inequality that you find in the data. In particular, during the period of time when we see a lot of technological growth, we do see a rise in inequality. If you think about the average household consumption versus the median, they very much diverge, and the average starts outpacing the median. And a lot of that is because the very top of the distribution just moves away from the center. Now, can we claim that this happens because of technological innovation? We cannot really say that. It's correlated with technological innovation. Could it be that something else happens at the same time, like the government decides to step in and help allocate wealth? I'm not sure. So I really cannot say based on our analysis, but there is a connection between technological growth and inequality. What role the government has to play there, that's very much outside of the framework. Having said that, when it comes to things like social insurance and the safety net and so forth, there you could tell that there is a room for that, in a sense that the market is not going to provide that kind of insurance. That's part of the reason why innovation shocks are painful, that there's a failure of risk sharing, and that the losers, as a result of this kind of progress, they cannot get insurance from the market. And so at the very bottom of that distribution, the government does have a role to play, something that the market cannot do. Right, so there are kind of basic examples that it's impossible for an individual to monetize their future human capital and buy insurance against very negative outcomes. There are all these moral hazard problems. The government is able to do that. So we're talking about things like social security and various types of insurance schemes.
You may not have the data, thank you, but what about the role of war as a promoter of technological innovation? 1860s, 1940s?
Again, this would be a causal statement. I mean, it's very hard to say what drives what. There are certainly some developments that do take place during the war periods because of the need and how important they are in the overall picture. It's kind of hard to tell. We never particularly asked about the war. You could ask these questions about many things, like the space race. How important was that? These would be kind of maybe colorful things to consider. We're thinking about very broad patterns, right? So we're not asking what exactly is driving technological progress. We take it as given, essentially, and we say, how does it affect financial market investors? You could go further, kind of deeper level of endogeneity and ask, technological progress itself is endogenous. And it's not something that we could just take as fixed. That's pretty clear. I mean, there are ways to stifle it, for example, right? It's maybe difficult to stimulate very high growth, but you could really bring it down. And that's where the government can play a big role. We have seen, as you can tell from my accent, I come from a background where the government was doing allocation of resources. And you could see, out there I would claim there was a causal link. Lack of growth versus government intervention in the markets and all sorts of activities. So.
Hi. I was wondering, what percentage of the patents did you find useful versus not useful in the research overall?
Well, our measure is continuous, right? So it's not a discrete dichotomy. It's basically, if you look at the distribution, it's extremely skewed so that, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it will be roughly half of the value coming from the top 5 or 1%, something like that. So it's very much that 90+% of the patents don't account for much of the economic value. Now, this is not to say that innovations covered by them are not socially or scientifically useful, just that from the point of view of firm valuation and the economic value, they don't account for much.
Leonid, most of this analysis is entrepreneurship. What kind of extensions can you do for entrepreneurship and in the private equity world? And do you have some follow-ups that you can connect to that?
Well, our framework is actually fairly agnostic about how exactly this innovation comes about. So we have a particular narrative in the model that tells you how that happens. But that's just a very stylized description. So the way I would map this into the empirical data is actually much more general, that the line to be drawn is between the value of innovation that accrues to the investors in public equity versus the value that goes elsewhere. And that's going to include a number of actors. Right? So this is going to cover instances where you have literally someone creating a new company in their garage and then taking it public versus a private firm that later on gets sold to a public firm versus an investor in early stage startups. That investor, I would lump them with the innovators because that doesn't go to the public equity space. And even employees of public firms who get a share of rent. Let's say you're maybe MIT faculty, you have a patent. MIT doesn't get 100% of the value. So they split the rent. And that's how I would think about sort of the dichotomy. So in my mind, there is no clear divide that needs to be bridged there, in the sense that this logic applies quite generally. What kind of data you want to collect at the micro level is going to be different depending on how you interpret the story. But at our level of analysis, we don't need to differentiate those interpretations.
Have you thought at all about the implications on financing innovation? And in particular, the question I would have is it better for a public corporation to fund new projects and try to develop new patents? Or is it better to wait until somebody else has developed them, they have identified that they work, they have value, and take them over at a premium?
Antoinette, you want to take that? I think we'll have a panel about this a bit later on. But as I said, in our model, we actually have Modigliani-Miller proposition holding, in a sense that there are no corporate finance frictions. And so these questions like, does it matter how you finance it, they just don't arise, period. So I would say that that's really one of the things that are outside of the scope of what we do. Not because it's not important, it's very much important, it's just that we're asking a different kind of question. To say, is innovation done more efficiently within existing firms? There is a large body of literature that looks at it because the incentives are quite different. The incentives of a monopolist to innovate are very different for the new entrant. So you're going to see differences in outcomes. But in terms of some kind of normative statement, what should we encourage, I really cannot say based on this line of work. It's about different types of questions. But it's an important issue.
Take one more question. Well, perfect. Thank you, Leonid.
Thank you.